we are hoping that all technology goes well, and that those of you that are sitting at your computer, other than the fact that you don't get any cold cereal, that you get the full benefit of being part of Friday morning cereal. So it's good to have you here. And so those that are online, as we come to the question and answer part, that we have Kelsey Johnson sitting here at the computer. So I guess the best way is just to write in the chat.
Type in the chat, yep.
Type it in the chat. And after Julian talks, as always, we look to the kind of questions as being a way to really energize the conversation. So if you have questions, put it in the chat, and we will then sort of use that format to see how that works. But we're so pleased today to have Julian Rankin. So Julian is the director of the Walter Anderson Museum of Art, and has been, he's been doing that for about 4 years. And he is making, an amazing impact to really take the museum's wonderful sort of history and his collection and really kind of expand it out and make it much more a kind of active and dynamic part of the social and cultural and economic energy here on the coast. Before he led the museum he was in Jackson as the director of the Mississippi Museum of Art. So he's had
Not the director, but
okay. Well, thank you.
it was there.
He was there. Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
Get him in trouble here. Anyway, so and he did that, I guess, for about 8 years.
Mhm.
So this is something that Julian is really, becoming a kind of leader in the state around how to take then, the kind of art that we have in our state and really open it up for the public. So with that, I'll turn the screen over to Julian.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Thanks to y'all for being here, and obviously to our students. Looking forward to hearing what y'all have to say and ask. And so as I'm talking, please do try to stump me with questions and things that we can talk about. So anything that seems interesting to you. The thing that, as you alluded to, I've tried to do when I came down here to the coast, and what's unique about the coast is that, well, every place is unique, I guess is the way to say it. The art of Walter Anderson is so integrated into the social, economic, cultural landscape that to really do it justice is about activating the collection in concert with the contemporary communities, issues, opportunities in ways that it might not be for, another museum in a different place. Every institution has a role to engage the community, but the way Walter Anderson's artwork and his philosophical framework it exists, it interfaces so directly with all of the maritime industry, aquaculture and foodways, even American history and conquest, and as Jack Davis, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize winning The Gulf a couple years ago, he says Walter Anderson is the artist of the Gulf of Mexico. So what that means for a lot of the work that a lot of other agencies and institutions are doing, like yourself, is we try to participate in that. And it just becomes natural. So what I'm going to do is go through, some examples of how we approach the different elements of the blue economy in this case, and how that all goes back to the collection. One thing I did learn from my time at the Mississippi Museum of Art with the director, who wasn't me, telling me these things, a good piece of wisdom: if you're in an art museum or any museum that collects objects, everything has to go back to the original object. What is the object saying? What's the scholarship behind it? What's the story behind it? That's where you have the leeway and the runway to do things. It's kind of like mission creep. If you're not doing things that are related to your mission, you're creeping away from it. If you're not doing things that are related to the original objects in museums, you're not really doing what you're supposed to be doing. So the blue economy, preaching a little bit to the choir, but in terms of what NOAA talks about, these elements that they prioritize their initiatives around, we are mirroring that to some degree. I mean, really, the blue economy is everything that happens here if you live on the water, basically. But marine transportation, ocean exploration, seafood, tourism and recreation, and coastal resilience. This is what NOAA talks about as their initiative priorities. So what we try to think about is, yes, those are all parts of the blue economy. The museum is overlaying culture on top of that. So, culture is why we do what we do, why we care about anything around us, what we hold, the values we hold, the knowledge we value, the the ways in which we make meaning for ourselves, for our communities, for our families. So culture is the story we tell. And so without a story, and this comes from my marketing background, there really is, um, there's no impact or momentum without engaging people with how do we make this relevant to someone who is not already interested in it. And for us, that's the big value of Walter Anderson's art, because it is such a big tent, beloved thing. We can use that to activate data and complex systems, stories and unheard voices that might not otherwise get a platform. We can do that with Walter Anderson's art because it is so broad. So I won't go into all the details of what Anderson believed, but I'll touch on a lot of these things. But for us, the mission of the museum, we recrafted this when I arrived in 2018, and it had been a very long, kind of very direct mission about art and preservation and so forth. But what we really want to do at the museum now is just to empower lifelong curiosity and connection to the natural world. And we do that through Anderson's art and other artists, artwork made by others. But that's the basic thing: lifelong curiosity, connection to nature. And that's what Anderson was about. He's about experiential exploration, perspective, creativity, self-expression, innovation, entrepreneurship. All these things in his family and biography are all about continuing to push into new frontiers, to explore and to invent new things. And that exists across all media, all sectors of life and work. So it's not just about making art that hangs on a wall. Another way to think about this culture deal is, this is Wendell Berry, who's a famed author, Kentucky soul and native, who writes a lot about and has written a lot about over 50, 80 years at this point, about what it means, agriculture, modernity, how these interact. And what he says is neither nature nor people can produce human sustenance. It's really the two, get humanity and our natural world, but we need culture. We need to be culturally wedded together. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about meaning making and story. So that's how we view it. So just to dive in, I'm going to just tease out a few of the artworks, collection-based resources that we have around certain elements of the blue economy, and then some of the programmatic activations that we do. So just to start, I kind of collapsed this marine transportation and ocean exploration into maritime industry and ocean exploration. So we think a lot about, Anderson being known for his journeys to the barrier islands, right? This geography of the islands that, while close to the mainland, really was a world apart for him. So if you think about transportation, well, he's a man that knew about marine transportation, right? But also just exploring to go further in the shipbuilding industry. And we think about, the engineering of a boat, a skiff that he did make that might not have been quite as seaworthy. It really is at base the same fundamental table of offsets when you build a canoe that you do when you're building a battleship. Much larger, but there is similarity there. There's math there. There's a, kind of a cosmic unity there. So when we look at his writings and his art, we see this conversation with, again, the experiential, what it means to actually be out in the water. He's talking here in his Horn Island logs, which were his log books that he kept over decades of going out to Horn Island. He's talking about being in conflict with a demon when he's rowing out to the islands. And he was very fascinated in this mythic quest that he was on, but he was also aware of the very real practical concerns of hurricane and storm, and also the need for, as he says here, the uttermost expenditure of strength and endurance to get there. Part of the value was the hard work that he had to put forth to get there. And that's present, I think, as I'll get into, in kind of even doing this work, like stretching and trying to make connections with new stories and places that we might not otherwise. So as I dive in, this is obviously a little bit of a shot from one of our trips to Horn Island. This is in a 29-foot cypress strip canoe. We rode out there and camped for 6 days. But just as a little entry point into some of the programs we do on the island, which we consider our most extreme classroom, right? So we're talking about industry, which I'll get to in a second, but this part is really the exploration. So this is a residency, an artist residency we did with a man named Lonnie Holly, who's pictured here. He's a internationally respected and collected artist who uses found materials and assemblage, and he's in museum collections all over the country, the High, LA. I mean, really any museum who is trying to collect a definitive kind of self-taught folk art. Lonnie Holly is a player in that world. He's from Birmingham, Alabama, one of about 20 children, I believe. He had like 13 foster families he lived in. He was sent to the Alabama Industrial School for Negro Children as a young man, which was a hard place to be, but he really kept this attitude of curiosity and would find things around Birmingham and build assemblages and really, again, he's a musician, and over the course of time, just became this legend in the art world, but he's also a mentor. And so the project here was to bring Lonnie Holly down and to work with students from Moss Point and Pascagoula to go out to the islands, collect things, and also collect things from the neighborhoods on the mainland, and to create a collaborative sculpture with the students. So we worked with the Maritime and Seafood Industry Museum, took a schooner out there. Many of these students, I almost say none of them, because I don't believe any had been to Horn Island before, some not even been on a boat before. So even as we're kind of overlaying, the journey out there, we're exposing students to things that they have not seen. And they're in such proximity to this waterway, to this island, but yet they don't really have a personal relationship with it. So part of it was to go out to the island, introduce them to that, and empower them to start thinking about material, both organic and man-made discarded material that they would find. And then when they came back from Horn Island, we spent a whole 2 days building collaborative sculptures with the students and Lonnie. And then we had a sculpture park, kind of ephemeral sculpture park installed out in front of the museum, had a symposium. And, it was really an amazing project that the students, you could see the impact. We interviewed them and got some really good evaluation on it as well. But that's just one example. And what Lonnie said, which is really interesting, and this I think is a good point to make. He was talking about Walter Anderson, and he said, when Anderson died, he said, I was at the Alabama Industrial School for Negro Children at that time. He said, but I was the same examiner of materials as Anderson was. He had this big old island. He said, I had off the beaten paths and alleys of Birmingham, Alabama. But he said, we were the same. And so just thinking about the connections, the siloed sectors or people or experiences that it's easy to kind of keep separate. Anderson invites us to connect all those things together. And so even with Lonnie's comment, his own personal relationship, that's how we view the collection itself. Another project that's dealing with industry. So this is us. I'm cut off there on the right side. You can sort of see me poking out there. But this is with two other artists. These are sculptors, Earl Dismuke and Erica Larkin Godet. Erica's in Waveland, Earl's in Oxford. So we worked with them and partners at the Pascagoula-Gaucher School District's College and Career Technical Institute, a CTE program with welders and engineers and machinists and marketers. They have about 17 different programs, allied health, otherwise. And we picked about 7 of them that had kind of applicable practical skills that would apply to public art. So first we went to Ingalls and sourced scrap steel from the shipyard. Took about, I think, 2,500 pounds of steel this first trip. We worked with senior interns and then also all of their different programs to design with community engaged conversation sculptures that would then be placed in downtown Pascagoula. And ultimately the fabrication happened in the facilities at the school district too. So right now this is a student welding one of 5 3x3 cubes, which made up a large sculpture, our first one, called Building Blocks. And the students led this design process. It was essentially oversized toy blocks that were representing Pascagoula's history, its industry, spelled Gula down the side of one and had the zip code. It had elements, symbols, if you will, of the anchor for A, the UFO for U, because everyone knows the UFO history in Pascagoula, the abduction, right? So we asked people, what does Pascagoula mean to you? And this was a container for those stories. And you can see actually the maritime flags also had a part to play. If you look on this one right here, these are all the maritime flags associated with those letters as well. And this is in the flagship district of the flagship city, right? That's what Pascagoula calls themselves. And this is where a lot of redevelopment is happening. So this is both workforce training, public art and placemaking, and then economic development. Try to create a kind of a nexus and a critical mass of public art gateways to that area, that while they're building new hotels and developments and expanding the streetscape, so forth, the artwork starts to define this area of downtown. And so there's one more sculpture to come. Two are installed now. Again, made with this had not all Ingalls steel in it, but the other two are completely made of steel from Ingalls shipbuilding. So that's one project that has been really successful, and again, blue economy in the industry elements of that. So then foodways and aquaculture, this is much of Anderson's art. We think about the watercolors he made on Horn Island or his block prints, but he made so much just about the society that he was living in. These are oyster shuckers. This is the pen and ink. So he was obviously not just in Ocean Springs. He was obviously in Biloxi a lot, biking over there, and the seafood capital of the world, really immersed in that. And then this was a little later, but in the 30s, prior to that pen and ink you just saw, he had done big murals as part of a federal program. And here you see floundering and sailing. And this was about American labor and certainly coastal labor. So you're starting to see in the collection again where these elements reside and how we can tease them out. So one project we did in 2020 and 2021, because it was COVID, it was digital. This was a digital humanities project that took all these different themes. Foodways was one of them, and several others, and then had scholars from around the country. We produced live streams and did scholarship, and then ultimately created a continuing education course around it. So this one was with Francis Lamb, who's a food personality and author, is a Iron Chef judge, and he's on a lot of the TV programs. He's a personality in that world. But he was our scholar here. He had done some work after Katrina in Biloxi with the Vietnamese communities and written a lot about that for the Southern Foodways Alliance. So we had a program with Francis, with Sue Wynn from La Bakery, with Mayor Fofo from Biloxi, and started to talk about all these things. And we also worked with other documentarians and family members who had their own experiences. So this is one photographer who had documented the shrimp sorting here happening. And then we worked with another family. This is Ty Van Nguyen, who was a first generation Vietnamese American, and this is some of his family photography that he loaned us for both an exhibition we did later and this program here. We also do things in person. So we've done several gatherings where we bring together, chefs, purveyors, DMR, and other, DEQ. We work with partners in the public sector space who are actually trying to, for example, get off-bottom oyster programs off the ground and or off the bottom, should we say? And you can even see Mike and Anita Arguelles in the bottom right-hand corner of this image, French hermit oyster, and then Alex Perry, the chef on the right there, and Vishwesh Bhatt, who's a James Beard winner from Oxford. Both of them were there, and we prepared things in the museum, had discussion, and talked about what we were eating, why it mattered, and where this stuff came from. So tourism and recreation, obviously the museum itself is an engine of tourism in Ocean Springs. This is another artwork that many of you might not have seen. It's just one of Anderson's kind of lesser known works or bodies of work, if you will, where he's painting people. This is the red bathing suit, right? It's talking about swimming and of course biking and going out into nature. That kind of recreation is something that he was performing. So we taking aside the museum as just a tourism entity itself, our actual recreational activities, again, tend to interface with the islands. We have at least 2 camping trips a year where we go out to Horn Island, camp for several days. This is one that we did actually with the canoe that you saw earlier. This was a little bit longer, a whole week out on Horn Island. And we usually overlay some art elements. We work with the National Seashore, the Park Service to have more instruction. We go out with the son of Walter Anderson, John Anderson. So when you're out there, it's both recreation, but it's also edification and cultural meaning making. So that's always fun. Another project that we did recently, I guess we wrapped it last summer. It's called Space Between the Trees, and this is actually on the Mississippi River. So while it's not on the Gulf itself, it's the same kind of idea that we took a lot of these students from primarily the Mississippi Delta and the Arkansas Delta onto the Mississippi River and onto the Mississippi River's islands. And we worked with Quapaw Canoe Company. They're a recreational wilderness guide set up out of Clarksdale. and they helped us do modules of, ecology and geology. We talked about all the different ways that the river works and gave students that actual knowledge base, but then they got to swim in the river and to go off the banks into the actual water, which none of them had done before. And this idea of breaking down fear by getting any age people on the water and allowing them to see themselves, achieving something, getting to their destination. I think in large part that's where recreation, the energy and the engine is coming from. It's people who love it, but also people introducing others to what that means. And in thinking about that, when we think about tourism, just kind of marketing, awareness, recreation itself, the storytelling media partnerships we try to cultivate. So this was an outgrowth of that week-long trip to Horn Island. This is a 7,000-word essay that I was allowed to write, pitched to Oxford American. And so we came back from the islands. I had all this photography and video and obviously audio recordings and just notes and things. And so we were able to put that in this quarterly publication in 2019. And one of the, many activations out in the public that people read and then want to know what's going on. I want to go to the islands, or I want to come to the museum. We also had a podcast that we did for that same publication that went out. So that's a little bit of how we think about kind of tourism and recreation. That's sort of the low-hanging fruit for us, but nevertheless, an extremely important part of what we do. So then thinking about kind of the environment itself, conservation, resilience, this is really like the STEM, the kind of first thing we would think about with what would the Anderson Museum be doing around STEM and STEAM. It's like marine education and that kind of science element. So we do a lot of work, again, going back to the collection. This is an osprey nest on Horn Island, Anderson painted. When we're out on Horn Island, we have to, of course, respect the nesting ospreys, learn about that. But also looking at when he was out there, he also collected things himself. This was a dead turtle skull that he had, and he actually, as a young man, had killed a sea turtle and felt bad about it for the rest of his life. So we pull from that biography and then start to think about what are the programs that come from that. One more artwork I'll show you. This is a dead pelican. So, we think about, in this case, the pelican probably died of any number of things, but as we go through the collection and we think about historically, we were able to talk about DDT and just the decimation of the pelicans and ospreys and eagles in the mid-century and what that means. But some of the programs that we've done recently have been really fun and actually have been working with another formerly design studio program that's now still with the Extension Service, Plastic Free Gulf Coast. So one was called Arts and Environmental Action, and this is actually on Deer Island. Dr. Eric Sparks and his boat took us out there, and I think he was actually operating the drone. This was about a 1.5 year long program with St. Martin High School, and the idea was to take the issue of microplastics, do data sampling, water sampling, get a body of data and actually conduct science, and then to figure out how can we use that data and translate it through artistic creation, whether that's film, block printing, illustration, guerrilla marketing, and try to get the buying practices changed within the school to have less single-use plastics in the cafeteria. So this was a Deer Island trip, one of our initial kind of adventures out. What you're seeing there is 3 faces. One of the artists we were with wanted to do this installation with the students to get them thinking. The one on the left, the smiley face, is all made with organic things. The middle kind of shocked face is made with plastics that were still intact. And then the one on the right, the dead face, was all decomposed plastic. So those things, styrofoam and other things we found that had begun to decompose. And, we cleaned all that up and left the organic material face on the island for someone to find. That wasn't the actual end product. We kept doing the data sampling. We went out to other landscapes, bayous, and areas of the school and started to play with natural pigments, learning about the plants, but also setting the stage for the creation that we would do. We ended up doing several different things. We had PSAs and recorded those, presented them to the school over the PA system. We did block printed posters and kind of guerrilla marketing vehicles, put those all around. And then ultimately we did an exhibition and produced with one of our filmmaking partners a whole short film. So we did a film festival, film screening, exhibition, and sort of symposium dialogue. The thing on the left that you're seeing is big mural was made with pigments that we processed out of dirt and other both soil and then plant material that we found the students harvested themselves and that the art teacher helped process. So you had this art and science at every level, from the museum with its partners, the school faculty, and then the students themselves, neither of which were all art or all science. And so we got that cross-pollination to happen. And it was all directed at an issue, obviously, that's critical to the blue economy and the future of the Gulf right now. And we're piloting, and we have piloted other programs that are now being scaled up through a grant through the National Academies of Science, which I believe is part of what we're even doing here, to do more of this work with schools across the coast. The last thing I want to mention is all of that work, the programmatic work, is being reflected on site with a campus expansion that we're currently undertaking. So it's called the Creative Complex, and this is the development of a lot that the museum owns right across from our main building that has had since time immemorial an old historic home on it. So that's what's pictured here. It's always been this building on the front of the lot, but it's a 300-foot deep lot, and that's never been fully developed or activated. So we renovated the art cottage, this historic property, which is where our education classes happen. But the larger plan, which is in process now and beginning to break ground soon on phase 2, is to create new construction in the back. So if you were to walk past the cottage, you would see nothing right now. What you will see is a 5,000 square foot new building, multi-story building that will house meeting space and gallery space, studios for visiting artists and lecturers, kind of residents. It'll have a maker space, workshop, both dirty and kind of clean workshop for fabrication, but also woodworking, potentially some small scale welding, where we can prototype things and ultimately fabricate things. And then also a kitchen and just some other amenities and classroom spaces for students and also visitors to the museum. And then what's not pictured here, because it's still in development, but will be accompanying this long building that goes back, is a sculpture garden and garden writ large with native flora, different elevations, garden rooms, places of kind of reflection. And so what that'll mean is when people come to the museum as visitors and the tourism side, they'll get an extension of the galleries that are kind of a living collection across the street. But for students and the programmatic participants, we'll have the capacity to have, again, scientists, scholars, poets, musicians staying at this facility at any given point, conducting their own research, making their own work, but then also leading programs with students. And we can do a lot of this on site, the same kind of thing we've been doing, in various places across the coast. We can actually have a hub for that, and then we can depart to the islands. We can depart, to Pascagoula and make more sculpture, or to Ingalls and get more steel, or we can conduct science on that site itself, and it becomes like a museum of process, if you will. And so what we hope happens is this becomes kind of the flagship educational arm of the museum, and people still have that pristine jewel box across the street where we preserve all the artwork, but then it's activated at the Creative Complex. So that's the end of my spiel. I'll leave you with a little sunset over Horn Island, and hopefully we got some questions.
So I'll jump in first. First of all, this is wonderful. Thank you so much. One thing that would be interesting to get your reflection on. I mean, it's interesting to imagine. I mean, when you're showing both some of the programs that you do and also some of the artists you've worked with, clearly a lot of the interaction, with this environment has a lot to do with the kind of human impact on it, right? You're finding trash, right? Finding trash and somehow dealing with that is kind of part of the of the consideration for this place now, right? So I was thinking about kind of Walter Anderson when he would paddle out. I doubt there was much plastic trash out there then, right? And so this sort of way the kind of art now and the kind of our consideration of our environment is sort of like in this kind of reflexive kind of time, right? Where we see where Walter Anderson clearly saw nature as being, sort of durable and almost like, it was a thing that was sort of fixed. And even though it was wild and treacherous, it seemed like it had, its own kind of stability, right? And I'm sure you reflected on this in terms of how we are at a time where we see, really the kind of the kind of the sort of fragility of nature compared to Walter Anderson, who kind of saw it as being bigger than him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a tendency to think of our time as always, the most important time because we're in it, right? But also perhaps the most, or to look back and think of other times as more or less, complicated. I think for him, he was prescient in many of his writings and artworks and philosophy. So yes, he wasn't dealing with the amount of plastic for sure, but he had grown up. He's born in 1903. He lived through this industrial and modern climb of American life where he couldn't go to Horn Island in the early 40s because it was being used as a biochemical testing plant by the Army during World War II. They were, and he once wrecked on Horn Island and thought he was dreaming because he woke up with machine guns pointed at him, and there was a railroad that had been cut through the island. So there was all this disturbance happening, and then of course seeing the bird populations fall and then come back right before his death. So and he actually, there was another great quote with Storm too, talking about fragility. Perhaps he did see it as ultimately stronger than anything. Nature maybe could not be defeated or predicted, right? But certainly the island itself was being cut up and shifting sands moving this way and that. And, hurricanes would tear out whole parts of the island. He once said after Hurricane Betsy in 65, which was the one that he tied himself to a tree and, felt the wrath of the storm as it made landfall. After he survived that and all the animals kind of came up like Noah's Ark on the little high ground he had found, he went and was exploring after and finding dead creatures but also all the things that had washed ashore. He called it a Louisiana house cleaning at the expense of Mississippi. All the stuff that had just like washed out here. And when I was on Horn Island several times ago, I found a big Power Wheels Jeep, like a kid's get in and ride, half submerged in the sand, and you ask yourself, how does that get there? So while he probably wasn't finding that material, I think he always was aware that humans are disrupting this. This was before he died in 65, before internet obviously and all this, but he was still aware of this attention economy that was driving people towards these circuits, prescribed circuits of living 9 to 5, the ticking clock, modern Chaplin's Modern Times, right? All this stuff was in his mind. And so breaking free from that, I think even though the circumstances and details have changed, I think he pretty much had the same notion of where we are now, even back then. And I think that was not because he was some genius or soothsayer. I think it's because it's pretty obvious what we've been doing over the past couple hundred years. We've been moving in this direction, and he was aware and perceptive enough to see those things happen. And so,
and how do you the whole kind of way that the kind of human impact is much more part of our consideration. I mean, what's your sense and how that kind of ties into the blue economy?
just the human's impact itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it back to culture, I think it's an awareness of what we have and where and just to speak in like bottom line terms for the capitalists, right? Like what is driving the blue economy? Why is it, a generator? It's the landscape, it's the environment itself. So there's the fear. I think the real fear is people not realizing through overdevelopment or mistreatment or whatever the case may be of where the bread is buttered until it's too late. You can't reverse it. So it's not the same story as like climate change globally, but just thinking locally, if people are doing things that disrupt the natural course of things, and the natural course of things is what's drawing industries down here who are doing mapping of the ocean floor, you have to have a awareness to connect those dots on the front end and have good planning, because otherwise people will make a mess of their own home. I think that's the real danger. It's a lack of awareness rather than the actual motivations to not protect it. I think the best thing about where we are now in terms of the blue economy is that people actually have put value, monetary value, on nature. And unfortunately, that's the only way that we can really get buy-in, is saying this costs you money if you don't protect it. And we saw that with like the Bonnie Carey spillway when you can't fish and all this. So I don't think that it's individuals are going to see the truth, hopefully, and then go against it. I think it's a sort of education campaign to make sure people understand why nature in the Gulf, um, why we have to rely on it in order to survive economically.
So Julian, we have Kenya from MSU asking us questions. You mentioned culture and telling a story. I'm currently going through thesis and working on tying my personal story to my artwork, illustrating life and death, mortality, and birth. Do you think that it is necessary to experience all forms of life and nature to be able to relate that to my artwork?
Well, I mean, no. To go back to like Faulkner, right? We all have our little postage stamp of land or of experience, and you write what you know, right? So, you know, while one can't make grand claims about things one hasn't experienced, I think an awareness of any element of that I think you're talking about, life, death, birth, rebirth in nature, and seeing that, is plenty to lean on. We just had an exhibition about that called Bearing Witness, and it was Anderson's artwork of dead creatures and dead nature that he found on the island, and another artist who did the same thing who's living now. We can get you a catalog of that, but the themes were witnessing and afterlife and memory, and kind of the challenge and resilience that happens when things die. If we don't pay attention to them, if we walk past the roadkill, we're missing part of the story. So I think just keeping eyes open, that's enough of an awareness. The thing about Anderson and Horn Island, and we try to tell people, it's not about, you don't have to canoe to Horn Island to get that experience. You just walk off the sidewalk a little bit. There's nature everywhere, and whatever bit of that we can commune with gives us that foothold.
Thank you. She's nodding.
Good.
I think it's kind of obvious how art and culture are a huge part of the coastal economy in any coastal region. And yeah, it's kind of interesting how those actual taglines get left off of many of the blue economy lists.
Mhm.
So I really appreciate that you're one of our first speakers on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think too, it's just, art is not necessarily, it's the same thing with art not being just something you hang on a wall, right? Art is not necessarily the driver or even a key driver perhaps of the blue economy, but the story you tell, whether you're talking about the blue economy or, anything, medieval history or whatever, you have to make it real for people in order to have any kind of groundswell of support and awareness. So I think that's where art and culture comes in, and storytelling more generally. And on the coast, we see visitors, maybe 70% are from out of town, right? So we don't expect Ocean Springs people to come in every day. But if we weren't there, they would have lost an engine that does actually have a part to play if people are trying to come here to work at Chevron from California. How are the schools? What are your amenities? Is the culture there, right? So in that sense, it is a key player, but also it goes back to that thing where if you don't have it, that's when you really miss it. There's not a traditional 4-year liberal arts college down here, like in Oxford, the bookstore and University of Mississippi, all the writers and literary scholarship. Down here, the museum in large part is the OR as well. And that's really the role we're playing, is trying to bring mass awareness through the Trojan horse of Anderson's art to all these other detailed, nuanced realities of what it means to be alive here.
All right, I got another one from Skylar.
Okay.
This is a big one. Adolfo, she's smiling. Adolfo Best Magard iterated the formula that Walter Anderson employed in his art. The 7 design motifs stem from organic shapes found in nature. The coastal environment, ecosystem, and weather, seasons of the Gulf are reminiscent to me as countries found on the coast of South Asia. A lot of their architecture calls back to vernacular design techniques, some relying on passive design strategies rather than active and mechanical ones. Do you think turning back the industrialized clock would help preserve the coast? You're making them think, Skylar.
Well, I mean, as someone who's happened to elevate my house because, where it was built in the 1940s, is not practical any longer. Perhaps, yes, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a complicated question, because what does that mean to revert? What do you keep, right? I think we always are getting better, so we don't want to jettison knowledge and expertise that we've gained. But I do think I think development generally, it has a valence of, kind of where's the common denominator? Who are you building it for? Is it simply to turn a dollar? Is it maximizing the best use of this property? We need the pendulum on the other side to have things that are built more passively for discovery and that are creating green space, preserving green space. So I think in that sense, we need to go back to a time when everything isn't driven by the immediacy of, maximum best use, and finding ways to do that. And some of that's happening in Ocean Springs, things that are coming along. There's a project called The Collective down on Porter Avenue, which is all about permaculture and farming and small business in concert with each other, and space, green space for concerts and venues and activity and activation by family members and young and old. So I think that kind of thing, which it would be a counterpoint to like Government Street, Bourbon Street Light, right? You do need that kind of thoughtfulness. But the 7 motifs, this hat is a little 7 motifs hat. The other 3 motifs are on the back. So they're all 7 are represented. But that goes, those design elements are critical to, Anderson's philosophy that there are all good ideas, or many of them are simple ones. So there are simple, basic things, whether you're talking about architecture and planning or design, storytelling, what have you. Things don't need to be overcomplicated. So I would say that where complication exists, it needs to have a function, and form and function. Back to Anderson's brother Peter Anderson and Shearwater Pottery and the arts and crafts movement. I think maybe that's the answer: is think form and function need to coexist, and we need to, as planners and architects and thinkers, try to figure out what is the function of what we're building, in order to avoid some of the pitfalls of, progress, if you will. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So when they went to the island, what was your most favorite thing that, maybe something that was unexpected or old or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the driftwood is fine, and actual things you find. There are so many cool pieces of driftwood. When I went out to the island the first time, which was right before I started, I camped on the island on, Friday through Sunday, and came on Monday, my first day at the office back in 2018. So I literally came off the island, off the boat, into first day. And I'd found a really cool, there were a dime a dozen, but these helmets that had washed off of the oil rig. So it's hard hats. And so, but I decorated it with Anderson motifs with a Sharpie while I was out there. So came back wearing this hard hat. So that became kind of a memento, and a piece that I was able to keep. But, I think the experiences on the island are really what you bring back more than objects. And so being out there and having a storm hit, having your tent flattened for 30 minutes, and then emerging, and experiencing some of that, or having alligators cross your path, or coming upon animals. I think those are the parts that really stick with you.
Julian, thank you for an outstanding presentation, for your energy and the direction where you're taking the museum. I'm really excited about Creative Complex and Sculpture Garden, especially the Sculpture Garden. And what is the timeline for that?
So we're actually finishing up kind of structural and civil. We have our building architects, which I didn't mention for the students. These are 2 former MSU College of Architecture Art Design grads, so tall architects working with us. So the building, construction documents are done. We've been trying to get civil and structural all finalized. So within the next month or so, the hope is to start phase 2. So if that takes, let's just say 12 calendar months to build the thing, and at some point landscape comes in there too, probably about 18 months from right around now. So beginning of 24 or so, we'll see when exactly it comes to the fore. But it's in process, and we've been fortunate to have federal and state support for a large part of it. Obviously, a lot of other support too. But the reason it's gotten funded with the sources that it has is because of this idea of a hub for cross-sector impact and study. And it's the education piece to all of the research projects that DMR or DEQ or whomever, the USM, Gulf Research is happening. You need the storytelling piece, and that's our contribution to the larger blue economy with that property.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple questions. They might be a little on the drier side, but one, I don't know if you could put out a question to the students. Wondering how many of them are familiar or not familiar with Walter Anderson and his work. Skylar obviously
Sounds like
is very on top of it, but I'm curious about that. And then backing up to your mission, I mean, it was a beautiful transition from the old to the very concise and very relevant and meaningful mission statement that you have now. And I'm just curious, is that something you just, with your graphic, your design background, you were able to just construct that and present it to the board, or is that something that was more of a community fed and driven process?
It was internal from the team. When I got here, we needed a new strategic plan, and so the mission, it wasn't even really a mission in what a mission is defined as. It was several paragraphs of things. It was like, an amorphous, more vision or what, that kind of deal. It wasn't really a mission. So I think when we were talking, I'd come from the Mississippi Museum of Art, and their mission at that time was to engage Mississippians in the visual arts, right? So it's very like broad but clear. And so for us, it became very apparent, even in that short time when I was immersing myself in the museum, that this curiosity and nature, those were the things that mattered, and then we do it through art. So it was a conversation with the board and the staff, but at that point we didn't have a community engaged part of it. Just sort of good, again, it fits. When things fit, sometimes they just emerge in that fashion. And then since then, we've learned so much about what our strategic plan really is. We're doing another one right now, finalizing it. A lot of that has changed, but the mission's going to remain the same.
Any more?
So Skylar wants to know if you think there will ever be shorter novice camping trip for people interested in Walter Anderson experience in his lifestyle, but don't have the equipment to camp out sort of for multiple days.
Yeah, right now the one that's more public facing, which is happening I think in early October. It happens in October and April. So it's a Friday. You go out and come back on Monday morning. So it's not super short, but it's also, we found if you go you can get a boat out there and stay for one night, but it's just like going on vacation. Like it takes you a little bit of time to really escape the the muscle memory of being on shore. And we can always help with equipment. So that's actually a pretty accessible one. We have guides, and there's a whole, it's more fun. You can do whatever you want. And we're not asking you to row out there. You get on a regular old boat and it takes you out. There's boats on call. There's, the base camp. So I would say that those are the ones that are pretty accessible, and they happen twice a year.
Okay.
But you can always go out to the island, just get someone with a boat.
Is it, when you go out there, is it ever like overcrowded, or I mean, this is like a.
The part of the island that's crowded is the western tip, which is the kind of party side of the island.
Okay.
So that when we were canoeing back, we went to the eastern end because that's more it's wilder. Not really the tip, but once you get to the eastern side, that's where you see osprey nests and lagoons, and it's just more dynamic. And then people don't go there as much. You don't really see many people at all unless they're fishing on the beach or something. But then you'll be leaving, and there'll be 30 people out, anchored in the waters, playing Toby Keith and hanging out, drinking beer. And there's not a tree on site on that western tip, so it's really just like a spit of sand. And it feels like the Ozark party atmosphere a little bit more. But we've hardly ever see anybody out there when we're camping, except for people who are exploring a little bit like we are, and that's if you stay on the eastern side, and that's what we find.
So how big is that island?
So it's about a mile wide at its longest point, and it's about 10 miles long. So when we canoed out there, we left from Pascagoula, and it was about maybe 8 miles from that point. So it took us, half the day or longer, but we got there, left about noon, got there about sunset, set up and everything. The last day before we were going to go back, we canoed from the eastern side to the western tip where we were going to head back, as I alluded to. That was the longest journey, was the actual length of the island. That took all day. So we were in the Gulf, for one. It was slower, but it was also 10 miles. But it was really cool because by the time we got to the western edge, it was sunset, and then it was like Planet Earth, the television show, sprung out in front of us. There was all these pelicans diving, going submarine, and the dolphins were going airborne, and there was an eagle and an osprey fighting over a trout up in the sky, and it was all, the magic hour that Walter Anderson talks about. So it was pretty incredible. But it's slowly shrinking, I should say, if you talk about blue economy. So when they dredge shipping channels in Pascagoula, the way the chain of barrier islands gets replenished is sand, going westward. And this kind of manifest destiny of the sand, ever westward, right? But it replenishes islands, and they slowly move, inches at a time over years, right? But as the dredge channels are dug, sand does not get back up the island, it just falls into the canyon, but the islands are still moving away, so they're not being replenished at the same rate. I don't know all the science. I'm sure there is like factors and so forth about how exactly the rate and so forth of that, but that's a good scientific but experiential story about how the islands are changing, and we have to be aware of it.
And the dredging happens because for ship traffic?
Yeah,
or
Pascagoula.
the barge?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm curious about the west side of the island. Obviously, we all pick up our trash after ourselves. Have you ever been over there? What's it like fresh wise? And
The times I've been there, it actually hasn't been too bad.
Good.
I'll say Deer Island gets more trash because it's so close, probably from campers. Maybe people respect Horn Island a little more. Maybe the ones who are,
that's good.
there is a respect, even if you're there just to have fun. I think the things you find are like the things that came from a long way away. We found these cards at Florida State that sent out into the tides for that express purpose. They wanted to find the coordinates of where they washed ashore. So we were finding, these cards that had been part of some research study 5 years prior, Florida State had sent out, those kind of things. But we did have a collection of objects. I mean, we were finding those squirt guns and toy balls, and we had made this whole museum of things we had found. It was pretty interesting, the kind of stuff, little things that you'll find, people's shoes. There's a whole lost shoe economy of Horn Island that sort of like the socks in our washing machines. So
Hair ties.
it's a collector too.
So Pat Bonk goes out frequently to Deer Island and picks up bags of trash. And I did it with him once, but walks the span of the island and with a few trash bags and starts, filling them up along the way, and on the way back, pick them up. I don't know how often he does it, but he does it frequently. So trash definitely happens on these.
Yeah.
Are
Yes.
there any historic structures still there or pieces of anything?
There's the railroad. You can find the railroad site. There's a ranger station. There's not a ranger that stays on Horn Island any longer, but the ranger station's still there. That's the only real piece of infrastructure. And you can find like where there may be the remnants of an old like water pump, that kind of thing. But there's not much left. There used to be a lighthouse. People used to. There's a whole history of Horn Island. A family lived out there, and they ended up getting swept away. And since it became part of federally protected, it's preserved as a wilderness. There's not going to be any development there. The ranger station probably at some point will go away too if they don't put a ranger back out there. So other than like I said, the railroad and some of the little more stonework or steel that was there, there's nothing, because there never was, in the last 50, 75 years.
Thank you, Julian. I did share your email address with the students if they have any kind of follow-up questions.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'll watch online and go make yourself a bowl of cereal. So.
First streaming session.
Yeah, but